for some extra time for people to join us this evening. Again, thank you for joining us. We're going to get started in just a couple of minutes. We're going to allow for additional guests to come into the meeting. Okay, I think we're going to get started with our introductions. Good evening, everyone. Thank you for joining us. Welcome to our Foundation's Event at Home series. Please note the session will be recorded and closed captioning is available at the bottom of your screen. We're so excited you can join us. My name is Felicia and I'm the Foundation's Donor Relations Manager, and it's my pleasure to be this evening's co-host. As most of our Foundation community knows, we are the philanthropic arm of the district. Tonight, we have a very special event created exclusively for our generous Foundation donors and friends. Our own College of San Mateo Professor of Ethnic Studies, Professor Seon-Hye will be leading us through our second lecture in our two-part series in honor of Women's History Month entitled, Can Dolly Save Us? Examining American Exceptionalism Through a Black Feminist Perspective. I'm going to briefly introduce Professor Moon, and then we'll hand the session over to her to take us through this evening's lecture. We'll have an opportunity for questions and answers during the last portion of our lecture, so we kindly ask that our audience use the Zoom chat box functions during this time period. We will also be sharing a link to our Foundation donations page in the chat box for anybody who wishes to donate to support our students. Professor Seon-Hye is an assistant professor of ethnic studies at the College of San Mateo. She earned her BA in literature from Columbia University and an MA in ethnic studies from San Francisco State. Presently, Professor Moon is working towards her PhD in cultural studies at UC Davis, and her dissertation research centers on gendered and racialized labors of early childhood education for us. Please help me in welcoming Professor Moon again to our Foundation community.
Thank you, Felicia. I will attempt to share my screen and resume my greetings. 1 second. Okay, here we are. I think you can see my slides now, right? In the browser window?
Yes.
Great, thank you. Thank you to the SMCCD Foundation team for, again, the invitation to engage with this community, which I'm a part of. And again, this is a part 2 of a conversation that we started a couple of weeks ago. And I'll for those who were not able to join us for that, I'll fill you in a little bit, because there are ways in which this is a continuous conversation. And yes, I am so grateful to be in this learning space with you today. So I'd like to first acknowledge that we at CSM, where that's kind of my home campus, we are guests on occupied Ohlone and Ramaytush lands. And for centuries, they have been the expert stewards of these grounds. Today's topic and this work is actually only a small part of the greater project of decolonizing lands and restoring Indigenous self-determination. As mentioned earlier, this event is part 2 of a series that the foundation is hosting in honor of Women's History Month, which was last month. And the first part of this series took place a few weeks ago. This was when ethnic studies professor and my esteemed colleague, Dr. Malathi Iyengar, and I had a conversation titled Processing Atlanta. During that time, it was just 2 weeks since the March 16th shootings of Asian American women spa workers in the suburbs of Atlanta. And our best sort of ability to process those events meant historicizing and contextualizing this violence, and noting the ways in which these women were hyper visible, hyper marginalized, and how this positionality was actually not a coincidence. Today, I want to continue a thread of that conversation that we started last time by extending the theme of gender violence, and also expanding on something that we mentioned only briefly in the last talk, this notion of US exceptionalism. So to make sure that I can stay on track, I've organized this lecture into 4 parts. In the first part, we'll revel in what many scholars and cultural critics are calling the Dolly moment in all of its dimensions. This part is for the Dolly fans and followers who may have seen the title of this lecture and they didn't have to ask, Dolly who? Which Dolly? And I'll follow this by contextualizing the emergence of the Dolly moment against the backdrop of the past few years of our very own socio-political context. Because without this juxtaposition of when this Dolly moment is really occurring, we can't quite know and appreciate the magnitude of the Dolly moment. After this, I'll dedicate some time to mining the incredible work of sociologist, cultural critic, and 2020 Macarthur Genius Award recipient, which means you can really call her a genius and mean it, Dr. Tressie McMillan Cottom. And she shares some incisive thoughts about interpreting the Dolly moment and its simultaneous invocation of US exceptionalism. And finally, I'll share some reflections about how this exceptionalism functions within our institutions, reflecting on sort of my thoughts of it as an educator, how it is embedded in the language that we use, the populations we privilege, the values that we insist on. And I'll then close with some thoughts and questions that we can ponder as members of a learning community. So the Dolly moment. In 2019, journalist Brody Lancaster perhaps summed it up best, and they write, open quote, "For every generation since the baby boomers, Dolly has always been in our consciousness, whether as a punchline or a headliner. Despite this endurance over her 50-year career, she's perhaps never been more prominent in pop culture than she is right now. Along with Abram Rod's NPR podcast, this year also saw her Jubilee performance at Nashville's Grand Ole Opry and Heartstrings, a new series dramatizing the stories behind some of her songs. It's an epic canon, right? The collection of Dolly Parton songs. And it's on Netflix, where last year she served as a guardian angel and roadmap for the title character in the coming of age film Dumplin', and the musical version of 9 to 5, for which Dolly wrote the score. And that was 11 years since it made its stage debut. These are some of the visuals to accompany Brody Lancaster's description of the Dolly moment. And you may have come across, these images and icons. This is the Heartstrings. This is the Netflix show. This is the NPR podcast, Dolly Parton's America, which I believe was a 7-part series. This is a picture of Dolly Parton at the Grand Ole Opry, celebrating her Jubilee, her 50-year career. And then 2020 did not fail to add to the Dolly moment, which Brody Lancaster really captures as really catapulting and sort of being in the moment in 2019. Excuse me. Because 2020, we saw her donate to vaccine research that has, as of this year, found its way to market and in some of our bodies, if you have received the Moderna vaccine. I found this meme-like artwork by celebrities on sandwiches. And I think that if you're a meme, you've made it. You are a pop culture icon. Then in February 2021, I think this is a moment that I became more personally interested in the Dolly buzz. There was a proposal, apparently with bipartisan support, which sounded like a feat because of the rampant partisan politics that we witnessed in the last decade, right? There was a proposal to erect a statue of Dolly at Tennessee's state capitol. Now that proposal would replace a bust of Nathan Forrest, a former Confederate general, slave trader, and leader of the KKK. So this suggestion, this proposal, did sound like a move in the right direction, but Dolly's response was interesting and tapped into the general anxiety or maybe the despair that I was feeling about the timing of such a proposal. So there's a headline that reads that Dolly Parton statue has Tennessee's support, but not pardons. And so she kindly declined and said, open quote, "Given all that is going on in the world, I don't think putting me on a pedestal is appropriate at this time. I hope, though, that somewhere down the road, several years from now, or perhaps after I'm gone, if you still feel I deserve it, then I'm certain I will stand proud in our great state capital as a grateful Tennessean," close quote. So these words, given all that is going on in the world, gave her a pause and ultimately becomes the reason that she declines. But for the people, for those who were proposing the statue of Dolly, all that was going on in the world appeared to be the very reason that they felt it was the right thing to do. So this disconnect is what I was feeling. And this was also what we'll be zooming in on today. So what is, quote, all that is going on in the world? The backdrop and disclaimer that, of course, there has really been no shortage of tragedy and crime and political upheaval from the past few years that we've all been subject to. But for the purpose of staying as close to our theme as possible, I'll only be mentioning a selection of events that pertain very prominently to gender inequity and violence. I just want to note that there may be some images or descriptions that I may be reading that may occur to be graphic in nature or triggering. So that's just wanted to let you know. So if we roll it back to 2017, the backdrop, we're still in the unrectified wake of the Me Too movement. Pictured here is Tarana Burke, founder of the Me Too movement, which since 2006 galvanized multiple generations of women who had been directly or indirectly affected by sexual harassment in their personal or professional lives. In 2017, we saw a slew of celebrities come forward, putting their lives and careers on the line to speak about and against the violence that was so endemic to their industries. In 2018, Nia Wilson was brutally stabbed at the Macarthur BART station, right not too far from us in the East Bay. She was slashed in the throat while her sister, Latifah, whom she was traveling with, was stabbed in the neck. Nia Wilson did not survive her wounds and bled to her death at the station. Also in 2018, following the retirement of Supreme Court Justice Anthony Kennedy, then President Trump nominated Brett Kavanaugh to replace Justice Kennedy. During the nomination hearings, we witnessed the testimonials by Professor Christine Blasey Ford, during which she detailed incidents of her sexual assault by the hands of Brett Kavanaugh during their teenage years. 2 other women came forward to testify about their experiences of being assaulted by him. The following week, Brett Kavanaugh was sworn in as Supreme Court Justice. And through the Trump presidency, his history of aggressive and abusive and misogynistic behaviors have been brought to light through the slew of accusers that have filed legal actions against him. In 2020, we saw the police violence resulting in the deaths of George Floyd and Breonna Taylor that triggered the deepening of a nationwide movement of protests against racism, white supremacy. Here, there are just too many names, but these are also reminders of all the unnamed victims that have died because of systemic racism and police brutality. And lest we forget that our Black brothers and sisters that we've lost at the hands of systemic racism and police brutality, they belong to their families and kinship communities. Here, artist Derek Forger reminds us that their mothers, their families, their caregivers have also lived through the terror. And it does not end with one court case, one verdict. This is a mixed media painting titled The Chorus of Maternal Grief. And in 2021, we seem to have a respite and a moment to pause, and perhaps even reflect upon the continuum of all that women's rights, kind of we have experienced through history, through the election of President Biden and Kamala Harris. But the moment was short-lived as we watched white supremacists break into the Capitol building, culminating a campaign of domestic terror. Then Representative Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez directly addressed this terror that she and her colleagues experienced while in hiding from the rioters. There was reason to believe that she and some of her colleagues, also women of color, were on a list of targets agreed upon by the mobs that broke into the Capitol. And we cannot discount the violence and despair that have been experienced by the women, the mothers, and the caregivers, while we have been disproportionately absorbing the reproductive labor of their homes. So while this may seem like a bottomless list that of all that we have seen, or a snippet of what we have seen in the past couple of years, what I'm illustrating is that the aggregate of these incidences of violence contribute to our sociocultural anxiety and rage and discontent that seems so far removed from the promise and the vision of a Dolly Parton statue. Then enter Dr. Tressie McMillan Cottom. Around February, as I was trying to reckon with the meaning of a Dolly Parton statue, Dr. Cottom published a long-form essay aptly titled The Dolly Moment. To be clear, though, Dr. Cottom is a big fan of Dolly Parton. They're both Southerners. They appreciate the simple sophistication of lyrical songwriting and storytelling. Among other things, they are also kick-ass at what they respectively do. But Dr. Cottom asks in her work as a cultural critic, not who Dolly is, because this is just a descriptive. Dolly, we know, is a singer and a songwriter and a movie star and an entrepreneur and a self-made one, a very successful one, an LGBTQIA advocate, and a generous philanthropist. And we love all of these identities. But instead, Dr. Cottom asks, what is Dolly Parton? And through this question, we can register the socio-political and the cultural idolatry happening, and the design and the logic behind what we're calling the moment that's surrounding the person that is Dolly. I have a snippet of this essay that I'll be reading. Dr. Cottom writes, open quote, Dolly is, as one breathless news story describes her, an actual angel, even for a moment, who has helmed many reintroductions to the public over her career. Angel status is a new level. And what you see begins here. Public relations magic cannot explain it all. Many celebrities do the right thing to garner adoration and attention. And that is the job of a celebrity. Ascending to something higher, something unassailable as Dolly Parton has done over the past decade, takes more than media savvy. It takes a willing political moment. If anything, becoming an emblem of a culture's highest valued attributes is actually resistant to public relations savvy. The artist doesn't create totem status, the culture does. I want us to take a moment with these words. Dr. Cottom is showing us the first lens with which to understand the logic of the Dolly moment, that there is a willing, that there is a choice, which invokes the active agent, an active agent that is doing the willing. And this is what we have to acknowledge, that culture doesn't just happen, it's constructed, it is sustained by its willing individuals. Individuals like you and I, we make a choice about what represents us and what we wish to represent us. Dr. Cottom, in the process of preparing for this essay, pored over all the books, the articles in the media by or of or about Dolly to conclude that, open quote, across all that close story, one story emerges. Dolly is a celebrity among celebrities, an icon and a national treasure because she has cobbled together a diverse, multiracial, pansexual audience for working class feminist songcraft and queer camp subversiveness. And we like that story as much as we like Dolly Parton. Rather, we like Dolly Parton because we like that story about who we are, close quote. And I know that was a mouthful. And I want to highlight these words of Dr. Cottom's sentence, this last sentence, because they, in aggregate, I believe, encapsulate the virtues and the values and the best version of what we believe freedom and progress in America is. Diverse, multiracial, pansexual, working class, feminist, songcraft, queer, subversiveness. These encapsulate not just what we believe freedom and progress in America is, but what we believe freedom and progress in America can produce, the futurity. And it's in this American story, one that is woven through these words that embed certain values, that justice always prevails. Success can be attained through hard work, which is part of the story. We have the freedom to marry and love who we choose. Artistic expression in this story is not censured. We have a democracy, we have individual political agency, and through Dolly's particular brand of what Dr. Cottom later calls Southern nostalgia, it manifests through Dolly's songwriting about Appalachia, working class women, idyllic scenes of the mountains and the pastures. Through all of this, the story emerges that America is innocent. In this story, America is even post-racial. It is very pro-woman. So, and as a Southerner, Dr. Cottom is no stranger to the history of the South that is being particularly invoked in terms of its mainstream histories and representations. But from the Black feminist perspective, Dr. Cottom is particularly attuned to how susceptible to erasure that she and others like her have been and continue to be in the South. I'll read this quote as well. Open quote, "There's the other thing about the actual South. White men might kill you, but white women could make you wish you were dead. When I was growing up, women who looked like the less trashy version of Dolly Parton, with the blonde hair and troubled physiques, were terrors. They police who among us is marriageable by policing the interpersonal relationships of school, work, and public life. Their manners hurt. They do not control the beauty hierarchy that disciplines all Southern girls and women, but they wield it, giving it vertebrae and thorns. These ladies represent a stratum of Southern society to which I could never aspire, should not even try to mimic for making a fool of myself for not knowing better. And Dolly turned that violent culture into a costume for all of our sophistication about race and racism, class and inequality, poverty and place. We accept Dolly's drag performance of a type of Southern womanhood without naming what it is. Dr. Kadam is a beautiful writer and a lyrical writer. Sometimes I kind of get lost reading her scholarship, but here Dr. Kadam gives us the second lens with which to understand the logic of the Dolly moment. The first was that there is a collective and a cultural choice, a willingness to uphold this particular icon. And the second lens is looking at what Dolly represents. And it's all of what we had discussed previously, but presented and framed in a way that only Dolly can encapsulate, not in a way that, for instance, Vice President Kamala Harris can encapsulate. This notion of drag performance, scholar Judith Butler has theorized that gender is a performance, a conscious practice based on norms of femininity and masculinity. When Dr. Kadam says drag performance, I interpret it as a performance of extreme femininity. And in this particular way, Dolly personifies the values of America by wearing a very unique particular costume of blonde, Southern, femininely figured, big-haired, trophy white woman. And given the backdrop of the race and gender-based violence that we have lived through, there is a logic of US exceptionalism that permits the possibility of comforting ourselves through a statue of Dolly Parton. It's this exceptionalism that proposes that this statue will forgive and forget the nation's history of violence against women. And it's also this exceptionalism that puts forth Dolly's drag performance as proof of America being a queer-friendly, progressive haven. I want to take a moment to connect this conversation with the last one of our series, in which we shared about Vincent Chen's murder as an extreme act of violence, but one that was operating along the same logic of microaggressions, in which people of Asian American or Asian descent are asked, where are you really from? And we shared that during this last conversation that all of these instances, whether micro or extreme, are predicated on the construction of Asian Americans being perpetually foreign. So just to recap, Vincent Chen's murder took place in Detroit during the summer of 1982. There was documented racial hostility toward Asian Americans during that time because of the success of the Japanese auto industry. And the Japanese auto industry, were perceived to be responsible for the decline of the American automakers. Ronald Ebbins and Michael Nitz were at a strip club, as was Vincent Chen, an Chinese-American engineer who was there celebrating his bachelor party. Ebbins and Nitz, both current and former auto workers, they assumed Vincent was of Japanese descent. They were heard using racial slurs while they attacked him, and essentially held Vincent responsible for the decline of American automakers. He sustained too much damage and he died 4 days later. In our last talk, we focused on how this construction of perpetually foreign also flattens everyone of Asian American descent as interchangeable. Chinese, Japanese, what's the difference? And how this sort of domestic experience of Asian Americans is actually a microcosm of US foreign policy. But today I'd like to extend the case of Vincent Chen as also being an example of the logic of US exceptionalism in operation, because it's this exceptionalism that condones Evans and Nitz as representatives of American automakers to criminalize who they assume to be representatives of Japanese automakers. It's this exceptionalism that also allowed these people to think that they can remove threats to their own discomfort without having to reckon with their own underperformance. This is the same exceptionalism that allowed Robert Aaron Long to claim bad mood or addiction as a reason to murder Asian women without having to reckon with the causes of his own addictions and downfall. And ultimately, this is the exceptionalism that defaults to whiteness, its supremacy, as a reason and the most important and only valid claim to civil rights. that justifies societal violence to redeem those rights. So where do we go? Where do I see in this last part? I want to connect it with my position as an educator, sort of where I see it around us in the language. So as I was preparing for this lecture, I came across a recent news article, and it struck me as an example of exceptionalism within educational institutions, just a very recent one. A few months ago, a high school Spanish teacher in Sacramento was teaching via Zoom and made an offensive slant eye gesture to her class, referring to people with Asian descent as having slant eyes. She made the gesture while explaining that racial stereotypes like these were prevalent through the 1980s. So if your guys go up, you're Chinese. If they go down, they're Japanese. If they're straight, you don't know. A student spoke up and documented this exchange, and the high school's administration was alerted, of course. I wasn't able to, at that point, trace what kind of disciplinary action the teacher was subject to, but I want to highlight the principal's response. Darius Hinson, Grant Union High's principal, said in a statement, "The video is shocking and disappointing and does not represent the values held by Twin Rivers and the community." It was a brief statement. It has since been removed, but in that statement, what was missing is an acknowledgement of the students who are subject to this microaggression during the class. There's nothing that was indicated what the high school was doing to help the students and address their trauma. I see exceptionalism operating in the selection of what to privilege. And in this statement, it's a brief one, but what's privileged is the school and its values, circle values. The students are really nowhere to be seen. So I just want to be clear that, we're not here to incriminate or criticize Dolly. There's nothing wrong with being a fan. There's nothing wrong with erecting statues. There's also nothing wrong with having or emphasizing values. Without values, there would be no compass with which we can move forward. But when the political moment wills Dolly to become the icon of her time, which is actually rife with violence against women, and when this political moment wills her to represent only one side of what America aspires to be, without regarding the reality of what America is showing itself to be, then a statue of Dolly falls radically short of realizing these bigger than America exceptional values. So I want to revisit the question posed, can Dolly save us? Because Dolly, the person, cannot. What we're seeing rather is what Dr. Cotton provocates. It's what we are, projecting. And those projections become the Dolly moment. They're adding to this Dolly moment around Dolly. So I feel like we have to actually revise the question, because what's actually happening is, can our values save us? And my response to that is that values are good and necessary, but values alone are incomplete. So no, to answer, they cannot in and of themselves save us. And when we insist that they can, when we only uphold, like in the case of the high school, the institutional values, and we erase the lives, we are upholding American exceptionalism. Values do not matter more than lives. Values and lives exist in tandem, and they are inseparable to realize the truest forms of justice. Being located within an educational institution, I was asking myself, especially from the positionality of an educator, do my teaching values and praxis align? Do my values supersede, or do they complement, or do they compromise my students' lives? And in whatever form, whatever positionality you are approaching this from, I invite you to reflect similarly. I wanted to note that, since we are within proximity of the San Mateo Community College District, which is an institution of education and an active community member, what are our community values? I think about the work and the intervention that is made possible by foundations like our own, because they're not of the educational institution proper, but they're extensions of it. And because of this design, they can execute things in a way that institutions themselves cannot. The best example I can think of is the renowned Macarthur Foundation. And I mentioned previously, they just recognized Dr. Cottom's work in a way that her own university, where she continues to teach, could not. And how they make such an investment, and it recognized her humanity, her knowledge, and her life in a way that her employer, that her academic field of sociology, and the public could not. I think the San Mateo Community College District Foundation is also well positioned to do this work. And I'm very excited to see their continued role in executing on the values that we uphold. I believe our foundation team is sharing the link to the site where you can find more information about the programs and the ways that our values have been invested into student lives. So out of curiosity, I know you're seeing a blank page. I revisited the Grant Union High School's Facebook page to see what has been up since the high school teacher Iceland debacle. And since then, there seems to have been a concerted effort to visibilize and celebrate the Asian Americans represented in their student body, particularly the Hmong community. There were 4 events that I could count in the last 2 months of their feed, promoting Hmong heritage, community calls for action, and active efforts to make the school a safe place for students, especially of Hmong descent. Just showing you some of the events and the calls that I saw. And in these efforts, I was able to see a glimmer of a willing moment by the school to recognize values and lives. Excuse me. So I'd like to end, sometimes I like to end presentations and lectures and just these opportunities with questions, because we usually have more questions than answers. And I'll tell you now, as we head into the Q&A shortly after this, that I don't have many answers. But building on the questions that we were pondering just a few moments ago, I'd like us to reflect, for the vocal but also silent survivors of Me Too, how can we uphold our values of gender equity while also recognizing the lives of the victims of gender inequity? And another question, for the grieving and the terrorized, angered families of victims at the hands of racist, gendered, sexualized violence, how can we uphold the values of justice while also recognizing the lives of those still living in pain? Is it possible? And finally, what would it mean to forget the values and focus on the lives? And that is my last question. And I would like to thank you for your time and attention. And I believe we have a Q&A planned during which the recording will be stopped. You should feel free to share your video, and we can revisit in an informal way any part of the talk that sort of called out to you. Thank you so much.